tonight, the homelessness crisis in Queensland Premier Stephen Miles' own electorate. I bet those poverty-stricken families wouldn't mind a French chateau. Calls for Matilda star Sam Kerr to be stripped of her captaincy, accused of racial harassment in the UK. Well, does our national hero deserve the benefit of the doubt? I'll look at this with Basil Zemplis and Jenna Clark a bit later. Also, the hypocrisy of the Teals. Look, they pretended to be friends of Israel to win votes, but now they're pushing for our taxpayer dollars to be sent back to a UN agency despite its terror links. But first tonight, we can reveal the talks between Linda Reynolds and Brittany Higgins in a Perth courthouse have today failed to reach any agreement. That breaking news there, they have failed to reach any agreement. The former Defence Minister is suing Higgins for defamation for social media posts relating to her alleged rape and workplace treatment. Now, there was intense media interest in this case today, everyone waiting to hear whether there'd be an outcome. And in her first words, Linda Reynolds told me just a moment ago, the mediation is adjourned for today, and accordingly, it is inappropriate for me to comment until it concludes. But my understanding is that no settlement has been reached between Linda Reynolds and Brittany Higgins and her fiancé, David Shiraz. There's going to be a second day of peace talks tomorrow, and if they can't reach an agreement, then we're looking at a 6-week trial that'll run in July. Now, Brittany Higgins and David Shiraz flew back from their new life in France for this case. They've bought a 5-bedroom mansion, presumably with the help from that $2.4 million taxpayer-funded compensation payout. Linda Reynolds has also pursued the ACT government, and just yesterday she was awarded $90,000. Then there's also a third case. She sued journalist Aaron Patrick from the Fin Review for his book Ego, and she's understood to have received an undisclosed sum. But her case against Brittany Higgins claims that Higgins defamed Reynolds in several social media posts, and Reynolds is also claiming that David Shiraz's social media posts suggested that she had pressured Brittany Higgins not to proceed with a complaint to police. Well, that's plainly false. Linda Reynolds did suggest that Higgins go to police. And she claims also that David Shiraz has bullied her in public. In one post, Brittany Higgins wrote, "I'm not the same naive 25-year-old girl from Parliament House. You don't scare me anymore, and I won't be bullied." That bullying claim right there. Well, there was a large media presence as Linda Reynolds and Brittany Higgins arrived at court for this 2-day mediation.
How hopeful are you getting this resolved over the next couple of days, Ms Higgins?
It's a difficult place for me. It's beautiful, but just personally, it's hard being back in Perth.
Do you believe Ms Senator Higgins is trying to silence you? Is there any hope of settling today, Brittany?
I think everyone's acting in good faith, trying to get an outcome.
Well, News.com's Samantha Maiden, who originally broke the Higgins story, she reports that the legal costs of this could potentially bankrupt David Shiraz, who Maiden reports hasn't worked full-time since February last year. So no full-time work, yet the pair have reportedly been taking business-class flights, buying a French chateau, and drinking expensive champagne. Well, presumably, this is thanks to their $2.4 million in compensation from the Albanese government. Yet it's not actually clear why this money was awarded so quickly by Labor, because in the Bruce Lerman defamation case against Network 10, Justice Michael Lee indicated in his courtroom comments that there was no evidence of a cover-up by Reynolds or the Morrison government. Also, that Higgins wasn't treated poorly or prevented from going to police. So why was she paid millions of dollars by the Albanese government? And given Justice Lee's remarks, it's also bizarre that Higgins and Shiraz don't simply apologise for the defamatory social media accusations against Reynolds. It's bizarre that instead they're stubbornly digging in and risking losing everything. It seems unless Brittany Higgins can be convinced to simply apologise, we will have the spectre of another 6-week court case drama. And as I've just revealed, so far, No deal after day one of peace talks. Now, I'll come back to that topic a bit later in the show with lawyer Sam Macedoni, but now to the faces of Australia's cost of living crisis. While leaders are trying to brush over the problem, pretend that the economic emergency is behind them, these people who you're about to see now tell a very different story. This is a makeshift community living behind a petrol station in the Queensland Premier Stephen Miles's own electorate. There are families with children and even babies. Their only access to water, reportedly, a nearby public toilet that has one male and one female cubicle. The parents all have full-time jobs, but they still can't afford a roof over their heads. You'd think with all the taxpayer funds we're paying the federal government, they could do better than this, instead of sending our money off to Gaza. The Courier-Mail, which reported on this issue today, wrote that the tent city represents the quick spread of homelessness across Brisbane during the cost of living crisis, expanding the problem beyond inner city parks where the population has traditionally found solace. Now, this mum, Rochelle Snedden, is trying to deal with homelessness while looking after her little baby, Paisley May. Paisley is just 6 months old. Rising rents forced her out of her home, and she's applied for so many houses since then, but no luck. The rental crisis is so bad in Queensland that it's reportedly like the Hunger Games, with some families like Jessica Taylor sending in more than 800 applications, but being rejected literally hundreds of times. Well, Rochelle says that the government is leaving people on the street. Locals have been trying to get in touch with Stephen Miles, their local member, but his office isn't answering the phone and doesn't bother to call them back. They don't seem to care. Another woman who lives in the tent city is Rebecca Kyle, and she was discharged from hospital on Monday, according to the Courier-Mail, after major bladder surgery. She tried unsuccessfully to contact Miles for help with housing, but now she's back in tent city where she's lived for the past 8 months. 8 months. Yet here was Premier Stephen Miles in Parliament today claiming he's done everything he can to help.
Mr. Speaker, I'm incredibly concerned to hear of people sleeping rough in my electorate of Marumba. A tent is no place to live, and certainly no place for children to live. I'm advised the Housing Department's critical response team has visited McKillop Park in my electorate a number of times in the past month and offered emergency housing to all the people there. They attended the site as recently as yesterday and will visit again today. I understand some people have accepted emergency housing, others have declined. I am committed to visiting as soon as I can alongside our hardworking critical response team. I want to hear their stories and deliver the support needed to get these vulnerable Queenslanders back on their feet.
He wants to hear their stories, but he won't bother to return their calls. Not even his staff will bother to return their calls. They're in his own electorate. If he wanted to meet with them, he would have gone there first thing this morning after the Courier-Mail's double-page spread in the paper today. You wonder if that's more misleading comments like the others relating to his text messages. We're going to come to that a bit later in the show. But we've seen from the Dunkley result that Australians aren't blaming the Albanese government for this cost of living crisis. Well, at least not yet. It is hurting Australians, no question. There's enormous pressure on vulnerable families to make ends meet, to just afford the most basic things like feeding and clothing their children. But the government is bizarrely not being held responsible, even though the RBA has made it clear that inflation is increasingly a homegrown problem, and even though Albanese himself made cost of living a key part of his campaign pitch when bidding for office. Here were some of his many promises.
A plan to address cost of living. Take pressure off cost of living. Pressure off the cost of living. The cost of living. Cost of living. Cost of living relief. Downward pressure on cost of living.
Yet since then, interest rate rises, unemployment has risen, petrol prices skyrocketing, energy bills have increased by up to 30%, and grocery prices have gone so high that the government has ordered a supermarket inquiry. And that's all before the news today that families will be slugged up to $436 extra a year for health insurance after the Albanese government approved some of the biggest increases in years. The Albanese government has also deliberately driven up immigration levels with 500,000 new migrants a year, and this has been putting enormous pressure on housing supply. It's a major part of the problem we're speaking about. So these faces today, these families where parents are working full-time but still can't afford housing, where their children don't have access to running water, well, this is the result. This is a shameful rise in homelessness in the heart of our major cities, and the government is to blame. All right, let's bring in now Sky News host Steve Price and former Speaker of the House Bronwyn Bishop. Thank you both so much for joining me. Look, Steve, from these poor people having to live in tent city despite having jobs, to taxpayer-funded French chateaus, I mean, the tale couldn't be more different.
No, and there's one thing in common on all those images you showed of the Prime Minister there talking about cost of living. In the background, nodding along as Albanese spoke, was a raft of state premiers. Now, we've got Labor governments in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, and that's where the housing issue should be solved. Now, Canberra's to blame on the immigration numbers, as you quite rightly point out, Sharri, but it's the state governments that have failed to build houses. Let me give you an example in Victoria. They have a housing statement that they released a couple of months ago. Laughingly, and you nearly fall off your chair when you say this, they have promised to build 80,000 new homes, wait for it, a year for the next 5 years, and they've not built one house. And in Victoria today, there was figures released that the housing approval rate has dropped by 16.7%. It's at its lowest level in 10 years. There's your problem.
No question. Bronwyn, look, what do you think of this point that I made, that there is a deep cost of living crisis? I mean, we're seeing the faces of it here, families who are living homeless, sleeping homeless. But why isn't the government being blamed for this, the Albanese government? We know they're not, as a result of the Dunkley by-election.
I'm not sure the Dunkley by-election does show that. I mean, there was, on the primary vote, a swing to the Liberal Party of over 6%. There was only a swing to the Labor Party with regard to their primary vote, despite the fact that there was a 40% drop in the Greens vote of 0.08%. So I think there's a lot more complicated story about Dunkley. But the one thing that is constant to all the other stories we've been dealing with is that it is the federal government's fault for the mess we're in. Once you start pushing up wages, petrol prices, fuel prices, all the things that add into the cost of living, and there is no productivity to make up for it, you've got a rat chasing its tail. And people are getting more money in their pocket, but they're not being able to buy more with it. They're buying less. So that private health insurance, how cynical to hold it up till this week after the by-election to announce the increase. That knocks out one half of the tax benefits that they're supposed to get on the 1st of July. So I think it's a story that's going to continue to unfold, and I think people will see that indeed the government is on the wrong track. Now we have to do something about fuel prices. Fuel prices feed into every truck that delivers a truckload of food to the supermarket. All in on the supermarkets where is the government, it's all your fault, but they are the originators of much of the problems that everybody's suffering. So what we have to see is that the focus has to be on the ingredients that are making this crisis and the sheer cold-bloodedness of turning your back by the Queensland Premier on those people who are homeless.
Oh, it's just appalling. It's shameful.
It is a story that has to be concentrated on and repeated again and again. and something has to be done about immigration.
Well, Steve, Peter Dutton announced his new look shadow cabinet today. This is presenting a new team. The timing, again, right after the Dunkley by-election result. He did have to do it at some point. Do you think they need to make more of an effort, the coalition, to put cost of living, to attack the government over, to make it attack the government over it and make it front and centre? So far this week, we're hearing about nuclear energy. Do you think that's going to have a lot of cut through with mainstream voters?
Look, I think nuclear is important, but it's not the issue that they should be concentrating on. There are so many issues that you've just raised tonight in 10 minutes that they could be concentrating on. They need to get into this proper debate about the immigration rate. It's too high. We need to put a pause on it. I know One Nation's been going on about it, but no one else seems to want to have this debate, the coalition included. Yes, they make comments about there's too many, but let's have a proper national debate about how big do we want Australia to be, how many migrants should we let into the country and where should they come from, and stop dancing around that issue. And I can tell you that family you showed in Brisbane and that tent city, I could show you one in every capital city. You'd find one in Sydney, or 2 or 3 or 4. You find them in Melbourne as well. There are people living rough right across all our major capital cities. And where else are we seeing that? We're seeing it in the Democrat-led United States, places like Los Angeles and San Francisco. And I wish Bronny was still in Parliament. You know what we need to do? All these state governments should do an audit of the housing that they own and find out how many of those houses, apartments and flats are empty. Because I know for a fact that there are hundreds of social housing places empty in Melbourne, in Victoria, and there are people on waiting lists that stretch for years.
Yeah.
Correct.
Look, you need some sensible people running the government, not the left-leaning bunch that we seem to have. Look, let's turn to the Teals' hypocrisy. The Teals have written a letter to Penny Wong urging for funding to be restored to UNRWA. That's the United Nations body that's been exposed for its links to Hamas and the October 7 attacks. They say that in this letter that they recognise the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza and the central role that UNRWA plays in providing relief. It is their clear understanding that unless funding to UNRWA is restored by the end of March, it will not be able to pay its workers in Gaza and it'll collapse. Bronwyn, among the signatories, the usual suspects, but what really surprised me was the inclusion of Allegra Spender. She represents the largest Jewish population in the country, and yet here she is signing a letter calling for funding to be restored to an agency that has been exposed for supporting terrorism.
Correct, which shows to me that the pressure from the Teal party has been so great on her that she's, in fact, totally let down her own constituents. And I say the same about Sophie Scamps in Mackellar. She, when she was first accused of supporting that motion of the Greens, if you recall, which again was supporting Hamas, she sent out lots of stuff saying, oh, well, I didn't really mean that, blah, 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 blah. This just confirms that she is part and parcel of the anti-Semitic movement that is going. Now, she will cry, no, I'm not, no, I'm not. But if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, I think it gets to be a duck. So we have to be very careful, I think, when we look at the Teals, a party which is putting discipline on those members by the look of it to me, to do an action like that.
Steve?
Bronwyn, don't forget also that, Zoe Daniel holds the seat of Goldstein, which has a massive Jewish population in southeast Melbourne, and Monique Ryan holds a similar seat with a large Jewish population. Most of these Teals have been elected in, middle to upper class suburbs in suburban Sydney and Melbourne with large Jewish populations. They're not doing for their constituents what they were voted to do. And I imagine there's a lot of people who ticked the box for these people at the last federal election who might not be doing it next time.
Look, I'm hearing that a lot from the Jewish community, that they feel let down, they feel misled by the likes of Allegra Spender, and I think the others, we saw their true colours earlier, but Allegra Spender was trying to pay lip service to the Jewish community. She was trying to show her support for Israel. She was doing the bare minimum when you compare it to Peter Dutton, Dave Sharma even, who was the former Worth MP is now in the Senate. But this letter 100% exposes them. Now,
it does. It just proves it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we're on the eve of Super Tuesday primary in the US. This is the single largest day of voting in the primary calendar that decides who will be the presidential candidates on the ballot this November. Donald Trump's path to the presidency got a whole lot smoother after the US Supreme Court ruled that the states did not have the power to remove him from election ballots, which some states had been trying to do. Bronwyn, what are you expecting to see? Do you have any predictions, any comments you'd like to make about Super Tuesday and how Trump's going to fare against Nikki Haley?
Trump will wipe the floor with Nikki Haley. He will be then well and truly on the way to being the endorsed candidate. And that decision by the Supreme Court was very significant because it was 9 judges all in agreement that you cannot do this. And that has a big roll-on effect onto a lot of the other so-called court cases, lawfare you could call it, that's going on in America. I think people are appalled that the Democrats aren't prepared to take their chances at a ballot box, that they're going to try and cheat their way into office. So I think that Super Tuesday will be, the result will be that Donald Trump will be the candidate.
I mean, it's an irony, isn't it? They've been accusing Donald Trump of running election interference, but taking him off the ballot box would have been doing the exact same thing. Dirty politics all around. Bronwyn Bishop,
Absolutely.
Steve Price, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you next week. Now, last night we brought you chilling vision of pro-Palestinian activists in Melbourne where members claimed that terror attacks were ethically justified. Well, in a disturbing new development, another video has emerged where a member of the Sit Intifada group that we exposed last night chants in Arabic, and the translation is that it's an honour to be a mother who has a martyred son. Have a look.
There is something very nice we say in Palestine Arabic. It's great. Every single martyr died, they go to their houses with a sweet, and they shout to his mother, said, "You are very lucky. I wish my mom in your place." How are you going to defeat us when we wish our mothers has the martyr in her house?
This is broad daylight on the streets of an Australian city. Men chanting their desire to become martyrs and for their mothers to have sons who are martyrs. And yet, as we spoke about last night, Victoria Police is yet to lift a finger. Well, coming up, Linda Reynolds and her former staffer Brittany Higgins have today failed to reach any agreement. As I reported a moment ago, I'm going to speak with legal expert Sam Macedoni about this. Plus, Paul Keating attacks ASIO boss Mike Burgess, calling for him to be sacked. Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Patterson will join me to discuss. Welcome back. Well, as I mentioned at the start of the show, Linda Reynolds and Brittany Higgins failed to reach any agreement today. Reynolds saying that the mediation is adjourned, but she can't comment further. The former Defence Minister is suing Brittany Higgins and David Shiraz, her fiancé, over a series of social media posts that she claimed damaged her reputation. Well, joining me now to discuss, Macedoni legal principal Sam Macedoni. Thank you so much
for your
time. Look, I think it's fascinating that Brittany Higgins is insisting on sticking with this. You know, as of day one of the 2-day talks, she's refused to reach an agreement or apologise. Even after Justice Michael Lee, in the separate defamation case that Bruce Lerman brought against Network 10, found no evidence of mistreatment. He made those comments in the courtroom and no evidence of a cover-up.
None at all. And yet they're still persisting. So it's really amazing, and trying to understand why she was paid the money in the first place is somewhat confusing, to say the least, because there was no cover-up, there was nothing done that deserved that payment, yet the Labor government made the payment. And
$2.4 million.
$2.4 million, which has, led to a purchase of a nice villa in France.
Presumably, we presume.
Well, exactly right. But now you've got these defamation proceedings by Linda Reynolds against Brittany Higgins and her boyfriend David Shiraz. There's a mediation that happened today. It went all day, no resolution. It continues tomorrow. And if there's no resolution tomorrow, we end up with a 6-week trial. It's going to cost everyone a bomb.
But that's the thing. I mean, Sam Maiden reports today that this could bankrupt David Shiraz. She reports that he hasn't had a full-time job since February last year.
It's true.
So why would they risk running and losing such a costly trial?
I think the only reason they're running it is on the basis that they think they can win it and therefore avoid any sort of payment. But unfortunately, the risk is that you won't win it. And given the evidence that is there, I mean, there were things said by both David Shiraz and Brittany Higgins about Reynolds' treatment of her during this case that were simply untrue. And the defamation, I think, is quite easily proved. So why they wouldn't settle, I really don't know.
Look, at another part of this whole saga, the ACT's former DPP Shane Drumgold had a minor win yesterday. He legally challenged 8 of Walter Sofronoff's damning findings that were made against him, and 1 was upheld. This is that there was a perception of bias, that he'd had an apprehension of bias for communicating with the Australians Janet Albrechtson. There'd been apparently 273 phone interactions, calls, texts and emails over 7 months. Do you think this has, even though it is only a minor win for Shane Drumgold, do you think this has also damaged Sofronoff's reputation?
No, I don't, because he made 8 findings. Only 1 was found to be unreasonable, and that's on the basis of an apprehension of bias. Not that there was bias, but there's an apprehension in the public eye that there could be bias, and that's why that 1 finding was set aside, and that is that they found that it wasn't unreasonable. So.
But it might affect Walter Sofronoff getting work in the future if people know that he's going to be talking to journalists behind the scenes?
I think that's something that he'd have to address in the future. But when you think that there are 8 findings, 7 have been upheld, he's done a pretty good job, I think. But he ought to be very careful about this apprehension of bias. And if you are going to have a lot of text messages, phone calls and lunches with a particular journalist, then there's going to be that apprehension.
Yeah. Well, if it emerges publicly, at least anyway, Sam Macedoni.
Exactly.
They obviously weren't using any encrypted apps. I can teach people a thing or two about that. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.
Now, Paul Keating has called for ASIO boss Mike Burgess to be dismissed, claiming that he's come to this conclusion because Burgess had revealed that China had run an extraordinary foreign interference operation that involved a former Australian politician, and also there was a plot to target a family member of a Prime Minister. Paul Keating claimed that the Albanese government had an anti-China Australian strategic policy and a mindless pro-American stance. Paul Keating said when the Albanese government was elected, the first decision it should have taken was to dismiss Mike Burgess, he's the boss of ASIO, Andrew Shearer, he's the head of the intelligence community, and Mike Pizzullo, the former head of Home Affairs. He says in the event, Pizzullo shot himself, but unbelievably, Burgess and Shearer still remain at the centre of a Labor government security apparatus. This says more about the government than it says about them. Now, let's bring in now to discuss this Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Paterson. James, look, Paul Keating absolutely smashing the Labor government over ASIO. What's your response to his accusations?
Sharri, this is a very serious attack by a former Prime Minister on 2 very professional, very highly regarded public servants in our intelligence community, and it cannot go unanswered, and it particularly cannot go unanswered by our own government. This is not the first time Paul Keating has done this. Last year at the National Press Club, he attacked the intelligence community and Penny Wong as Foreign Minister. And the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister rushed to the public defence of Penny Wong, the one person in that group who's perfectly capable of defending herself. But our intelligence community leaders can't defend themselves. They're public servants and they work in the intelligence community. They can't respond to Paul Keating. And so it's incumbent on the Prime Minister and the ministers for those intelligence agencies to publicly back them against Paul Keating's attack. because these are very dedicated public servants, professional public servants. You know, Mike Burgess is a patriot. He's done an outstanding job at ASIO. Andrew Shearer is the intelligence professional of his generation and the best connected Australian in Washington, DC. And it is not fair to have their reputations besmirched by Paul Keating and not responded to by the government. Let's not forget, Sharri, that the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, in responding to one of Mr Keating's previous outbursts, has said Paul Keating is always worth listening to. Well, it's up to the Prime Minister, I think, to say tomorrow whether or not these comments are worth listening to or whether or not, in fact, he refutes them and backs the intelligence community leaders that he works with.
Yeah, and look, you know, you have to wonder why Paul Keating has said this. I mean, Mike Burgess just trying to raise awareness about foreign interference in Australian politics. That's why he said he put this high-profile example forward, although refusing to name anyone. And you just have to wonder why Paul Keating is jumping to China's defence yet again so quickly. Look, also, there was a shadow cabinet reshuffle today by Peter Dutton, and you were one of the winners, James Paterson. You'll now be adding the position of Shadow Cabinet Secretary, along with Shadow Minister for Home Affairs. So this means you'll be playing a leading role in developing policy. Look, I think the Dunkley result indicates that Liberals do have some more work to do. Are there any areas that you think the coalition needs to focus on to get in the game for the next election?
Sharri, there's absolutely more work to do, but we knew that before Dunkley. In fact, we've known that since the election. And the good news is that my Shadow Cabinet colleagues have been hard at work doing the boring but necessary policy detail to be able to offer the Australian people a very comprehensive, very ambitious and very serious agenda at the next election. Those costings are being done right now. Stakeholders are being consulted, experts are being brought in and issues are being debated. And I'm very pleased to be joining that process formally and working with my Shadow Cabinet colleagues to bring it forward. There's obviously a pressing need in a lot of areas, in the housing portfolio, in energy, in national security, in immigration, in tax. And the Shadow Ministers have already publicly outlined their intentions in those areas. And now it's our task to bring forward that bulletproof policy publicly, and I assure you we'll do so.
Now, James, you did a sensational job at Senate estimates getting answers or exposing the failings of the Albanese government. One area that you asked about that hasn't been reported yet is funding packages for both the Jewish and Muslim communities of up to $25 million each. The Jewish grants, or the grants to the Jewish community by the Albanese government, were under the category of community safety, and they were awarded to rapidly, and I'm quoting here, rapidly implement additional security measures for the Jewish community. So physical security measures for mostly schools and preschools. But on the other hand, Australian, Palestinian and Muslim communities received social cohesion grants, which can go towards activities like media monitoring and fact-checking. James, what does this tell you about where the funding for both communities are going and what it's going to be used for?
Sharri, there's no doubt that both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are equally morally repugnant. But we also know from the data provided by Victoria Police that one of those problems is far more prevalent than the other problem. In fact, Victoria Police data shows there's been 10 times as many reports of anti-Semitism and arrests than there have been of Islamophobia. And yet the government is treating these as equally serious problems, but giving different types of assistance. So the Jewish community is told, here's $25 million to deal with the consequences of anti-Semitism. You can build a bigger wall or you can install an extra security camera at your schools and synagogues. The Muslim community is told, we're going to help you deal with the causes of Islamophobia. We're going to give you taxpayers' money to effectively engage in public activism, publicly funded activism, to deal with things like misinformation, fact-checking and media monitoring. What is the reason for the Albanese government not treating these communities equally, particularly when we know the problem of anti-Semitism is far more prevalent? I think it reflects a failure to approach these issues with equal seriousness, and that's unfortunately been consistent since we've dealt with this unprecedented crisis of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, which the Albanese government doesn't want to know about. This crisis has been completely under their watch. James Paterson, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. There's now a major development that I can tell you about tonight. This is in relation to that extraordinary suppression order that was designed to silence the media to protect the identity of a Melbourne activist who was charged over the alleged kidnapping of a man employed by a Jew. Now, lawyers for Sky News and other media outlets, including the Herald Sun, The Australian, 7 and 9 News, Rebel News, will be challenging the order tomorrow in the Melbourne Magistrates Court. The media outlets, with Justin Quill, media lawyer, leading the process, have been given a date. It is tomorrow. This lack of transparency has been deeply concerning, especially considering the seriousness of the allegations. So we're going to keep you informed and right across this. Now, coming up after the break, Matilda's hero Sam Kerr's brush with the law has taken some of the shine off the superstar. But should we give her the benefit of the doubt? She is our national hero after all. I'm going to chat about this with Basil Zemplis and Jenna Clark after the break. Welcome back. Well, Matilda's captain Sam Kerr will face trial in England after being accused of harassing a police officer. She's pleaded not guilty to the charges and is set to face trial in a year's time. The alleged incident apparently happened a year ago, but there are now calls for her to be stripped of her captaincy for failing to tell Football Australia officials about the criminal offence or alleged offence. Joining me now is Perth Mayor Basil Zemplis and the Australian Associate Editor Jenna Clark. Great to see both of you. Basil, what do you think about this? She is an inspiration to young Australians, well, to all Australians. I mean, before there was Taylor Swift fever, we had Kerr fever during the World Cup. Does she deserve the benefit of the doubt from us on this incident?
It was only a little over a year ago that the City of Perth Council gave her the keys to the city of her hometown. She's loved and revered right around Australia. But she does deserve the benefit of the doubt, clearly. I think everybody needs to calm the farm. We do know that this is alleged only at this stage. If she's guilty of anything at the moment, it's of not telling people that there was an incident and that it was being looked at. Pretty clearly, she was hoping that it wouldn't come to this. And I suppose had it not come to this, had the charges not been laid, she wouldn't have been guilty of anything whatsoever. Chelsea is her first responsibility in the jurisdiction where it happened. That's the club she plays for in the UK. Had it got to her telling Chelsea, then I suppose you'd expect that she might have whispered it in the ear of Australian officials as well. But until such time as she is guilty, until such time as the circumstances around it have been explained or we've heard about them in court, not guilty, Your Worship, and nothing to see here just yet.
Yeah, look, this is said to have happened about a year ago. We don't know the details. We know nothing about the details. It's been reported that there was a racist element to it. She said something racially charged. We don't know if that's true. We've also seen questionable conduct from many British police officers in recent months, the way they've handled the pro-Palestinian protests. So, you know, you're inclined to give her the benefit of the doubt. But Jenna, you know, as Basil just said there, the accusation against her is that she failed to inform Football Australia that she was facing a criminal charge despite the rules. Do you think that she should be stripped of her captaincy, as some are calling for?
Well, it will be interesting, Sharri, considering that she will miss out on the Paris Games in the next couple of months. And I think it is interesting that the Matilda's, you know, PR sheen, it's yet to see whether that has come off a little bit. But I think if anyone knows anything about image, it's definitely Samantha Kerr. And, you know, crisis comms 101 is just be transparent. If there's an issue, you need to get ahead of it before it happens. But again, I think the details are very murky. The wheels of justice move incredibly slowly in the UK system. So again, it's just a watch and act at this point in time, and let's see if the girls can make a difference on the pitch and whether that brings it back into light.
Yeah. Now, well, look, all I can say is let's hope that it's not true, and let's hope that it's been a big overreaction by UK police. Now, Queensland Premier Stephen Miles, he was embroiled in yet another scandal. His leadership really facing a difficult time at the minute. He's had to apologise for misleading Parliament. This was about sending a text message to a colleague while actually in Parliament. He denied he'd sent a text to Assistant Minister Ali King back in October, but then Channel 9 last night produced a photograph of his phone that someone had obviously taken from behind him, showing there was a text message. Here's what the Premier said in question time today.
I understood the question related to compliance with right to information requirements and answered to the best of my recollection. However, last night it was brought to my attention a photograph taken in the chamber while the Legislative Assembly was sitting. I wish to update the House and advise that I, as the member for Marumba, did text the member for Palmerston during question time, which was the subject of the member's question. The text message was from some time prior and I did not recall it at the time. I therefore wish to correct the record and apologise to the House for the error.
Basil, this is the problem with what he said. He says you can't recall it, but just look it up in your phone, mate.
Can't be that hard, can it? I tell you what, you'd love to know how they got a photograph of the text message over the shoulder. That is a remarkable piece of photography. And for Stephen Miles, you feel a bit he's clearly a bit unlucky on that score. What we do know is honesty is the best policy. What he's got caught out for really is not so much the gross act of indecency, which is texting a colleague in the chamber, although that goes against the rules. That's not a sackable or hangable offence out in the general public. But getting caught out lying about it, that is the bit that really undermines the Premier and his leadership. And a reminder for everybody, including aspiring state politicians, that your best bet is just to tell the truth, no matter how insignificant you think it might be.
Yeah, always good advice. The cover-up is worse than the crime. Jenna, now you have actually some advice for Stephen Miles because you've got some piece of technology on your mobile phone that no one can see from the side. You can barely see looking down at it.
Yeah. And now I can impart this wisdom on the potential next sitting member of Churchlands in Western Australia. Privacy screen is exactly what you need to get a hold of. And I only found this out when I was covering politics in WA a couple of years ago, because in the press gallery in WA, you actually sit right above the MPs. And I noticed that there was one who has now since left politics, he retired, was playing Words with Friends during question time. And I thought, I really am never going to be in a position where people care about what I'm texting, but I just don't want that to ever be in the public knowledge. I was playing Words with Friends at work.
Not that you would ever do that, so you went and
I'm just downloading, Sharri, Jenna, I'm just downloading that app now and getting it on as quickly as is possible.
Yeah. Now, a lot of talk about nuclear energy at the moment. The Prime Minister has really come down hard on Peter Dutton's plans to have a new nuclear energy policy for the coalition. But today in Melbourne, we saw climate change activists, climate loonies, standing on top of a truck. They were blocking traffic during Melbourne's peak hour this morning. Basil, this is so frustrating to travellers, to commuters in the morning.
Well, as we've said many times, haven't we, respect everybody's right in this country to protest peacefully and lawfully. But if you want to get the Australian public offside, try disrupting their commute to work or their commute home. And nothing gets the Australian public quite offside like people doing these sorts of things. It is totally ridiculous. It's very counterproductive to their arguments. Yes, they get some attention, but they don't win any favours, any sympathy or any support for their arguments. And for what it's worth, Peter Dutton, I think, has said everything is on the table. They'll look at renewables, they'll look at gas, they'll look at nuclear. And I think that's fair enough and sensible for Australia's energy needs going forward.
Yeah. Just on another topic, Jenna, Health Minister Mark Butler today signing off on a 3% rise for private health insurers. This will cost people who have private health insurance up to $436 extra a year. He didn't have to sign off on this, Jenna.
Yeah, well, this is the Deirdre Chambers of policy, Sharri, and well, it's arrived just after the Dunkley by-election, which is what the opposition were up in arms over last week in the last sitting week of Parliament. And look, NIB, they're going to up their premiums, and so is Medibank. I think every Australian at this point in time is just going, seriously, what else can be increased? Everything is getting so expensive, and I think it's going to be interesting just to see what the fallout to this will be, both politically and for the health system, whether most people do decide to start walking away from private health.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, a lot of people are walking away from it anyway because they can't afford it in this cost of living crisis. Basil Zempilas, Jenna Clark, loved having you on. Thank you both so much. Now, after the break, I'll break down the latest data with Leith Van Onselen and discuss the high immigration levels and whether this is contributing to the housing crisis. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, ABS data published this week clearly shows that businesses are expecting a slowdown in spending. And with the economic growth numbers for the December quarter to be released tomorrow, some economists are now predicting that our economy might start to show signs of a small contraction. Macro Business Chief Economist Leith Van Onselen joins me now. Leith, what do you think? Do you think we could be heading towards a small contraction or even a recession?
Yeah, look, I think actually, Sharri, we're going to post some very small, modest growth tomorrow, probably about 0.2% or 0.3% for the quarter. But once you adjust for population growth of around 0.6%, we're going to have another quarter of a per capita recession. So basically, that'll be the fourth consecutive quarter where the economy hasn't grown as fast as population growth. So while the overall economic pie will probably still grow slightly, everyone's slice of the pie is going to continue to shrink as it has for the previous 3 quarters.
Yeah. Look, we've spoken about the impacts of immigration on housing, and at the start of the show I spoke about this story in the Courier Mail today where families, where the parents have full-time jobs, are now sleeping rough. They're in tents in Stephen Miles, the Queensland Premier's own electorate. You know, this is a serious housing and rental crisis in Queensland. Do you think this is a direct result of the high immigration numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not just a Queensland issue, this is a national disaster, I'll be quite honest. So Domain released some rental vacancy data for this week, which showed that the rental vacancy rates collapsed to just 0.7% nationally. And it's about the same, it's about 0.8% in Brisbane and, 0.8% in Melbourne and Sydney, I think. But it's basically, disastrously low. And this has basically pushed heaps of people into group housing and also into homelessness. Now, the worrying thing about this, Sharri, is that actual housing construction has collapsed to around a decade low. We only built about 170,000 homes last year. The latest dwelling approvals data, which was released this week, showed that we only built 163. We only got 163,000 homes planned. Now that's about 77,000 below the Albanese government's housing target. So it's nowhere close.
Well,
at the same time, we're obviously.
The Albanese government promised that they would hit a target of 1.2 million homes over 5 years. But as you've just indicated, that data showing that dwelling approval trends are clearly going backwards. I mean, this is going to be another broken promise. It's not just a political problem. I mean, this is impacting Australians right around the country.
Yeah, and it's obviously occurring at the same time as the federal government's ramping up immigration to record levels. Now, we had 626,000 population growth last year, of immigration nearly 520,000. So what they've basically done is they've ramped up housing demand without worrying about where people are going to live. And this has obviously driven the rental vacancy rate to a record low. It's pushed rents through the moon, and it's driving people into homelessness and share housing. So this is a Labor-led housing disaster that we have on our hands, and it's brought to you by the federal government, which has decided to flood the nation with people without worrying about where they're going to live.
Leith Van Onselen, it's an absolute crisis. You have been calling it out here on this show for over a year now. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks everyone for your company tonight. Right now, here's Paul Murray.